Hey, good morning. I'm Patricia Murphy. It's Monday. This is Seattle Now. The Trump administration recently moved to open up more public lands in Washington state to cattle grazing and logging. We'll talk more about what this could mean for our public lands with the Oregon Capitol Chronicle's Alex Baumhart in a minute. But first, let's get you caught up. There is troubling news about child welfare in Washington. Last year, 35 children died, and nearly 49 nearly died from abuse or neglect after having some connection to the state's child welfare system. According to the Washington State Standard, that's more than state officials previously reported. The budget passed by the state legislature this year does include some new money for caseworkers and public health nurses. An independent state watchdog is recommending a roving unit of caseworkers who can travel to parts of the state with fewer resources, but that initiative has not yet been funded. The city of Bellevue has lowered the speed limit on neighborhood streets from 25 to 20 miles an hour starting today. The city says more than 350 new speed limit signs will be installed, and there's no warning period for the change. The Bellevue City Council voted for the reduced speed limits 2 years ago. Supporters say it will make roadways safer, especially near schools. And despite recent layoffs, Seattle has the second most tech talent in the U.S. and Canada, according to a new ranking. It was compiled by the real estate firm CBRE and takes into account wages, education levels, and recent computer science graduates. The Seattle Times reports AI growth is bolstering Seattle despite job cuts at Microsoft, Amazon, and other tech giants. The only metro area in front of Seattle? Yep, you guessed it, the Bay Area. Rounding out the top 5, Toronto, New York, and Austin. Check back for more headlines on tonight's episode of Seattle Now. More than 12 million acres of land in Washington state are national public lands. That means while the land is managed by the federal government, it belongs to everyone. More of that land might soon be open to private industries to use for cattle grazing and logging. In Washington, areas around Lake Chelan, in the North Cascades and Okanagan National Forest, and several other spots in central and eastern Washington would qualify. The government says the move would make the land more resilient, while conservationists argue restrictions are the best management. Alex Baumhart covers the environment at the Oregon Capitol Chronicle as a senior reporter. She's here now to break down what the future of our lands might look like under these new rules. Thanks for taking the time, Alex. Really appreciate your reporting.
Oh, thanks for having me.
So let's start by helping our listeners understand what we're talking about here. What are the rules about grazing and development on public lands right now, and what might change under the Trump administration's proposal?
Our public lands have these sort of edicts, vague but somewhat legally sound, that they are used for beneficial public use, natural resources, and the health and vibrancy of economies in rural communities, that they are both preserved and also used. We have sort of these twin mandates to both allow extractive and developmental industries, and also that we must protect these precious resources we are extracting and developing. So when it comes specifically to the grazing rules, there's about 240 million acres of grazing land that's managed by the Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management. It's public, right? So these livestock owners basically get a 10-year lease to graze on that acreage. And, you know, much of it is in Washington, in Oregon, in these sort of eastern grasslands. And they pay an annual fee for the privilege of grazing on that. It's significantly less expensive than any private or even state-managed grazing land. It's really a small portion of the livestock industry relying on these public lands for cattle grazing.
Okay. What was the original thinking behind restricting millions of acres of land to grazing?
The idea is quite simply having cattle on the landscape, and I point to cattle just because that's the largest group of livestock that are out there, and they're heavy, right? I describe this in the most plain math I can, which is, 2 cows is like the weight of a Toyota Corolla. So while it's not obviously speeding across the landscape like a car, these are pretty big animals to have lumbering over the landscape. They drink water like you and I. They often defecate right by the water they're drinking from. They eat endemic species, grasses, brush. Cheatgrass is widespread across the West. It's an invasive species. It's been really bad for the wildfire cycle in sagebrush territory. So it's kind of pushed out sagebrush, which is a traditionally wildfire resilient plant. Now we have these cheatgrasses with thin roots. They suck up a lot of water. The cattle love them. The landscape would be much healthier without them. So yeah, we protected these 24 million acres historically because we realized that having livestock on the landscape at large scale does come with costs. And a lot of those acres were set aside because they're home to species that are imperiled or threatened. They're near water supplies that you and I and other people rely on. And they also might be in areas that are beautiful, right? And we don't necessarily want to be dealing with large fleets of cattle and manure and everything that comes with them when we're also trying to enjoy these beautiful spaces.
Okay, and the Trump administration also wants to cancel the roadless rule. We've been talking about cattle here, but what about roads and logging? Why restrict where that can happen?
On our public lands across the U.S., and especially in the West, there was a ton of logging on federal land, pretty unfettered for the first half of the 20th century. And we're paying the costs of that. That's no doubt a part of the wildfire scheme we find ourselves in, right? The number one cause of wildfire is human beings. The number one cause of roadside fires is human beings. The bulk of wildfires that have occurred in Western forests over the last 30 years occurred by roadsides. And I think the important thing to remember that also gets lost in wildfire seasons is the biggest wildfires we've had in the West, in at least Washington, Oregon, right? Because we're sort of behind California in our fire debt. They've been on grasslands. The biggest fires in Oregon in the last few years have been on grasslands. So when we're talking about opening up more land to livestock grazing, which significantly increases wildfire risks, we're sort of compounding our issues.
And just for clarification, we're talking about beef cows, right? Not dairy cows.
Exactly. This is just cattle for beef consumption. I think one of the things that's been a masterclass for me in reporting on public lands is we actually subsidize their preservation, every taxpayer, and we do that out of recognition that it's all ours, right? We also heavily subsidize the development of them. When you build roads in BLM or U.S. Forest Service land, we're paying for that. When you have to bail out livestock grazers because of drought, livestock grazers who have permits for federal lands, we're paying for that. We subsidize more than we get back from the grazing side. ProPublica did a pretty good investigation a couple years ago. Suffice to say, even when we get these sort of conversations, I think, happening at a deregulatory level, I think this administration's been pretty consistent in unleashing things, unleashing the cattle industry, unleashing the timber industry. It's not because that pours a ton of money into, general public coffers. It's because there are private companies that stand to make a lot of money off of this.
Let's talk about the supporters of this change. What are they saying?
So this change is obviously a boon to the cattle industry. However, because it's being litigated, right? Because these conservation groups are suing over it, I think there's a bit of a restrained celebration. So the head of the Oregon Cattlemen's Association was like, I'm sure it'd be great for us, but this will be in court for a while. We really don't have a sense of whether or not this will be quick, whether it'll be drawn out. We don't have a sense of all of the areas that would be approved or will be approved. Right now, basically, the Bureau of Land Management has this sort of potential map, but it doesn't seem like the livestock folks that I've talked to have sort of bought in entirely to the idea that this is going to fly, just because this is the way that land management natural resource fights go. It'll be decided in court, and then maybe there'll be a little bit more sort of outspoken celebration from the livestock folks, who at this point are mostly just a little irked that something they thought would be good for them is, again, being derailed by conservation groups.
And we talked about the subsidy versus the return. Do developers and ranchers need more land?
No doubt. I think they do, and they would say that. And of course, these are ranchers and livestock operators of totally different size. And they're dealing with different markets depending on where they are, even in the West. I think the bigger issue for a lot of folks in the cattle industry and beef industry right now is the processing monopolies, the companies that sort of overlord the beef processing, that drive the prices and basically control the cost of not only raising livestock, but the profit or not that these producers get. On top of that, they have competition from global beef industry now, from Argentina, from Japan. It's tough. The sort of beef and cattle market is very fickle. So I think they need more land, but I think structurally they might need a heavier hand in their free market that seems to be rewarding sort of large multinational corporations.
I'm trying to think of the benefits that could come from this change. Would my beef be cheaper if I wanted to buy a steak if this were to go through?
Not likely. About 3% of the beef in the U.S. is from livestock that are grazed on public lands.
Now, if these changes won't lower the price of beef, who's going to benefit from them?
The folks who already have these leases, folks who really want to get them. 24 million acres. Well, you already have 240 million acres open for grazing. So we're talking about essentially a 10% increase in what's already there. There are plenty of mom and pop cattle businesses, livestock businesses that depend on and benefit from using these public lands. There are also a lot of really big operations run by incredibly wealthy people who will probably benefit from this. It is 90% cheaper to graze your cattle on public land than it is to procure private land healthy enough for cattle grazing. It's incredibly risky to be a private landowner tending to ranch land and tending to a cattle herd. Every wildfire season, you're sort of wondering if you're going to be burned up.
All right, that's the ranchers. Conservationists say this is a bad idea. The Center for Biological Diversity is suing. What are they saying?
The most sort of compelling legal argument is this is being done without any consultation with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the U.S. Marine Fisheries Service, which are responsible for administering the Endangered Species Act. So you really can't just open up millions of acres to grazing without consulting the people who manage the Endangered Species Act, because there are threatened, imperiled, and endangered species on that land. That's a reason that a lot of these grazing acres probably weren't on the sort of usable list before. So there are some very specific species that the Center for Biological Diversity has identified as at risk. The Oregon spotted frog, and even honestly, grizzly bears and wolves, gray wolves, have been sort of on and off the threatened and endangered list. Those species are on there in part because they're the first to get shot when cattle are lost on the landscape. The conservationists are basically looking at this and saying it's been hard fought to get these species protections. You can't just decide that you're going to turn your back on that.
What might happen here with this lawsuit? How might this play out, at least in the short term?
First step, probably an emergency injunction. I can imagine a judge looks at this and says, there's reason enough here to believe that we need to put a pause on this until we can have a full sort of courtroom hearing. This is going to play out in court for, I'm going to say, months, if not over a year. If the case that Center for Biological Diversity has brought fails, I presume there's other conservation groups like an Earth Justice that are ready to jump in. The reality is the U.S. Forest Service spent 2 years going across the country, and particularly the West, holding hundreds of public meetings with people in areas that would be impacted to hear about their concerns. They roped in that feedback into the law. They made special arrangements with Idaho and Colorado. They made special arrangements with tribal governments. A lot of this was to meet people where they were at and to understand that a policy wouldn't be perfect, but it wouldn't be even humane if they had not talked to the people who would be most impacted by it. Fast forward to the rescission of this whole thing. USDA and Forest Service haven't held a single public meeting. They held one month-long public comment period. They're about to hold one more before they finalize this. So the only thing that is sort of pumping the brakes are these lawsuits from the Earth Justices, from the Centers for Biological Diversity. And these groups have been around for a long time, and court's always been the way to do it.
Alex Baumhart is a senior reporter at the Oregon Capitol Chronicle. Really appreciate you taking the time. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to Seattle Now. If you want to be a good steward of public radio, keep your cows from grazing on our wires, and maybe take a minute to rate and review the show on your podcast app. Today's episode was produced by Brooklyn Jamerson Flowers. It was edited by Caroline Chamberlain Gomez. Our production team also includes Vaughn Jones, Andy Hurst, and Paige Browning. Greg Kramer does our theme music. Seattle Now and KUOW Public Radio are members of the NPR network. I'm Patricia Murphy. Talk to you tonight for Evening Headlines.